The Israeli military has withdrawn once again from Gaza's Al-Shifa hospital.
This move comes after a 2-week-long operation in the heart of Gaza City. The Israeli military claims it had killed and detained hundreds of Hamas militants in the hospital area since the raid started. People who live in the area say they found dead bodies and destruction.
Meanwhile, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is saying they will go forward with an expanded operation in Rafah. Israeli and U.S. officials are meeting today, virtually anyway, to talk about that plan. Let's go to CBS News foreign correspondent Holly Williams, who joins us now from Tel Aviv. Holly, you know, one of the accusations against Hamas is that they not only use human shields, but they use those shields because when those shields then die, they can win a public relations war. You had a very interesting conversation with a Hamas spokesperson on this subject of the public narrative around the war. What did he have to say?
Hey there, Tony. Yeah, look, I interviewed Dr. Bassem Naim. He's Hamas's head of international relations. It was quite a combative interview at some points because with the war now in its sixth month, I really wanted to push Dr. Naim on what he and Hamas believe the October 7th attacks actually achieved for the Palestinian people. Because after all, Hamas claims to represent Palestinians. It portrays itself as a liberation organization. And although there's been conflict in this region for many years, this particular war was ignited by the October 7th attacks carried out by Hamas, in which around 1,200 people were killed here in Israel. Now, his response to what October 7th achieved for Palestinians was that it had garnered the war following it, that is, had garnered sympathy, support, and, quote, exposed Israel as an apartheid state. This is how the conversation then continued.
It sounds as if you're saying that you think Hamas has won the public relations war during this conflict. Is that right?
Yes, I think yes.
But the cost of that public relations victory has been 32,000 Palestinian lives by your count.
Again, I think it is unfair to accuse me of being responsible for the genocide.
I also asked Dr. Bassem Naim whether he thought that Hamas would survive this war, because after all, Israel's stated goal is to destroy Hamas. His answer was 100% yes. Now, you might say, well, of course he would say that, but, you know, other more objective observers agree that Hamas will survive, and their argument is that Hamas, above all, is an ideology, and it's very difficult to kill.
So, Holly, you've also been covering the protests that erupted in Israel in response to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's handling of the war. What are people telling you about the military's operations in Gaza? And from what you're hearing, does it seem like support for the war is waning there in Israel?
Well, Lilia, I think people have multiple reasons for being on the streets. In Jerusalem last night, we saw people calling for the resignation of the government, including the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. There are other factors that go back to before the war. Corruption allegations hanging over Netanyahu that he refutes, a judicial reform program that many people are very angry about it. But then when you come to the war, many people blame Netanyahu for the alleged security failures that occurred on October 7th. Many people believe that the government should be doing much more to bring the hostages home, essentially whatever it takes in the negotiation. Some people believe that Israel doesn't have an achievable strategy in Gaza, that there's no end in sight. And some Israelis just want the Israeli military to leave Gaza altogether. Now, these are the biggest anti-government demonstrations in Israel since the war began. That's according to the Israeli media and the protesters themselves. I should point out that according to the most recent polls that I've seen, still a majority of people in this country support the war and its goal of toppling Hamas. But also, one recent poll that I saw showed that 57% of Israelis think that Netanyahu's performance during the war has been either poor or very poor.
Holly Williams, thank you so much for your reporting. And CBS News senior White House correspondent Weijia Jiang is at the White House with more on this same topic. Weijia, the U.S. is holding virtual talks with Israeli officials today in an effort to deter a military invasion of Rafah. This is something that the U.S. has been trying to do for quite some time, and Israel has not seemed responsive. On the contrary, what's the latest? How's the U.S. actually pressuring the Netanyahu administration and the IDF?
Well, so far, Lilia, it has been a change in posture and tone, but no change in policy with regard to sending aid and weapons to Israel. And that is why critics have issue with this meeting that's happening, and they want to know what message will be delivered. And even the meeting itself has a bit of drama attached to it, because it was actually supposed to happen in person here at the White House last week with an Israeli delegation visiting. But then Prime Minister Netanyahu canceled because there was a vote on an immediate ceasefire in Gaza with the United Nations, and the U.S. did not veto it as it had in the past. And so Netanyahu wanted to send a message, but then things got shuffled around. And now there is this virtual meeting today with an in-person meeting expected to follow. And the U.S. has made very clear that it does not support a ground invasion of Rafah, because there are more than 1 million civilians there. And, you know, that type of operation could obviously have a huge impact there. But Netanyahu has said publicly that he believes this is the right move. And it's hard to imagine how he will be convinced otherwise at this point. But today is an opportunity for the U.S. to present alternatives, to present its own proposals, which is a first, because up until now, the U.S. has been very hesitant to say anything about how the IDF ought to operate.